almost as soon as I took the women in, I got a house for men. And because I recognized, because really, why I was so even-handed is because my mother and my father were both from dysfunctional, violent family homes. So I was never under any illusion that it was the two of them, particularly my mother, because she never liked me. And she was the one who was physically very violent towards me. My father was more terrifying. One of the days that I will never forget is this knock on the door, and I went down, and it was a woman with a very black eye and two tiny children. And I just looked at her, because we were packed out. And I said, "Where did you come from?" And she'd come a long way from Southampton, which is on the coast in England. And I said, "How did you hear about us?" She said, "My social worker told me." Because in those days, women were sent back. They were told that, they'd come and visit, and after all, what are you doing to upset him? Are you provoking him? And then the other problem was they'd say, "Okay, if he's that dangerous, we'll take your children away and take care of them. You have to find your own accommodation," which means that she'd never get them back. And the other problem also, unless she had a family to go to who would protect her, there was no money, because as soon as she tried to go to get some kind of security money from Social Security, they'd say to her, but your husband, in those days mostly, your husband wants you back, so therefore you're not entitled to anything. As the women came in, the volunteers that I had left, understandably, because it was frightening. Some of the women were as violent as the men they left, and violent to their children, because they too, like me, had come from violent backgrounds. Men were such an important part of our work, because very quickly the women and I, we talked about it a lot, saying, yes, if we ever get any money, the first thing we do is to try and get a man to come and work with the children, because many of the children hadn't known good gentlemen, because the families had been violent. And so half the staff at the refuge were always men, and then we suddenly heard that no men could be employed, no men could work in refuges, and can't today. They can't sit on the boards. Boys over 9 or possibly 12 can't go into refuges, or you call them shelters. Their mothers have to make other arrangements for them, which I find shocking. Yeah. And it ring-fenced money, because the only money available, which it became over the years, it's $1 billion industry. Violence against women, they get something like, well, it's $1 billion and over a year. And an awful lot of that goes on really supposedly rehabilitating men, but essentially punishing them with something that's called the Duluth model. The Duluth model was I think it was Minnesota where it was designed. And essentially, before a man he has to apologize for being a man, because behind the radical feminist ideology is that all men are potential batterers and rapists, because it's the patriarchy, it's the Y chromosome.
Hamill and Russell, in acknowledging the symmetry in perpetrating intimate partner violence, note that there is a significant underrepresentation of empirical evidence and subsequent training knowledge on female-perpetrated violence. There are various evidence-based recommendations for more effective treatment programs away from the Duluth model. First, it is very essential to comprehensively analyze available evidence on the various aspects of domestic violence that exhibit symmetry. These aspects, as outlined by Strauss and Scott, include perpetration, mutuality, coercion and control, and other risk factors such as histories of physical and substance abuse. The default perception of domestic violence as unidirectional, with men being perpetrators and women being victims, ignores male victims and fails to treat female perpetrators. However, as examined in other videos in this playlist, between half and 2/3 of domestic violence is mutual, despite that women are more likely to report severe injuries. Men and women should be assessed separately for the determination of differences in treatment needs, thereby avoiding the implementation of one-size-fits-all interventions. Second, avoiding the feminist presentation of domestic or intimate partner violence is fundamental in developing more robust programs. As it is known, domestic violence was first highlighted by the feminist movement. The resultant social programs, especially batterer interventions for men and recovery shelters for women, were based on the presentation of domestic violence as an outcome of male sexist attitudes and the patriarchy, and the assumption that destroying the patriarchy would lower the rates of intimate partner violence. Some studies maintain that there is minimal evidence suggesting the contribution of sexism to the perpetration of violence. For instance, Petrick and colleagues point out that the abusers in their study felt powerless and intolerant to being controlled. Subsequent treatment programs did not account for the abusers' feelings of powerlessness or the increased comfort of being open with their partners. Sugarman and Frankel, in assessing the relationship between battering wives and maintaining a patriarchal ideology, revealed that abusive husbands reported positive attitudes towards marital violence and scored lower on masculine and feminine gender schemas. Assaulted wives scored higher in feminine agendas and exhibited more liberated gender attitudes. Archer's study of 2006 uncovered that female empowerment and individualism are associated with reduced female victimization and increased perpetration of abuse. Further, the feminist presentation of male-perpetrated violence as the normal dominance associated with masculinity is flawed because those arrested for perpetrating violence, both men and women, have histories of substance abuse, present narcissistic and antisocial characteristics, and grew up in families with abuse as outlined by Strauss and Scott. Third, the re-education approaches in the batterer management programs should be replaced by therapeutic approaches that holistically account for perpetrator attitudes and the co-occurring social and psychological challenges. The Duluth model, and the resultant programs, are developed based on a social work perspective that fails to use DSM-related diagnoses, thereby ignoring therapeutic approaches to treatment. The consciousness-raising activities used by the model to challenge male dominance end up being confrontational, even to those caught up in instances of mutual violence, thereby expressing minimal to no interest of controlling or dominating their partner. Re-education is not appropriate because severe violence exists, but is not dominant. Instead, therapeutic approaches to treatment offer a better solution to minimizing the risk of recidivism. A notable advantage of therapeutic approaches to treatment is the reduction of group sizes for the attainment of desired group therapy-related outcomes. Saunders and Hanyasa, in assessing attitude and psychological changes in the course of cognitive behavioral treatment for abusers of female partners, reported significant reduction in anger levels, sexist attitudes towards women, jealousy, and depression, thereby changing the outlook of treating abusive men. Taylor and colleagues, in examining the efficacy of group treatment sentences for abusive men, revealed higher completion rates for 8-week programs, but lower reoffending rates for those who completed 26-week programs. Taft and colleagues observed that combining group alliance and therapeutic factors predict significant reduction in recidivism. This reduction could be associated with a less confrontational approach to treatment, thereby minimizing abuse-supportive attitudes as well as dropout rates. Compliance with therapy-related homework moderated the relationship between alliance ratings and psychological abuse follow-up. Scott lists levels of psychopathology or depression, substance abuse, and reduced anger as the strongest predictors of reduction in abusive behaviors. Faulkner and colleagues evaluated the effect of cognitive behavioral therapy on male spouse abusers and revealed reduced levels of guilt proneness and increased group conformity. This conformity enhanced problem-solving, assertiveness, communication skills, and anger management. Attitude-related changes towards love indicated increased physical attraction, emotional intensity, and commitment. Modifying cognitive behavioral therapy to focus on skill development as opposed to relaying information also achieves the highlighted outcomes. Overall, cognitive behavioral therapy registered a significant reduction in violence, changes in sexist attitudes, and lower levels of narcissism. Fourth, additional research is required in examining the treatment needs of men and women who perpetrate violence. Andrews and Bonter define needs in criminality as factors, such as traits, behaviors, attitudes, or personalities, that increase the likelihood of offending. Studies on batterer programs focus on their efficacy as opposed to the opportunities for continuous improvement. Dutton documents the significance of strong therapeutic relationships, emotional regulation, stress tolerance, and anger management in addressing trauma symptoms and attachment needs in individuals who perpetrate violence. Noteworthy, anger management influences thinking patterns and responses to various situations and relationships, both of which enhance the motivation for change. Psychoeducational approaches to treating batterers do not recognize attachment-based personality disorders that significantly influence the attainment of desired therapeutic changes. Murphy and Eckhart lists the cultivation of relationships and the motivation to change as some of the most significant features of therapeutic processes that seek to resolve abusers' cognitive patterns. The authors note that intimate partner abusers present variations in violent behavior, motivations for engagement in violence, and readiness for change. Therapists are required to collaborate with clients in establishing working alliances, eliminating threatening and assaultive behaviors, altering abuse-maintaining beliefs, building better relationships, addressing past trauma, promoting active coping, and reducing the risks of relapse. Other theories perceived to be controversial place the success of batterer intervention programs on both men's and women's commitment to change. Feld and Strauss argue that once marital violence commences, it continues throughout the life of the marriage. The level and persistence of wife assault is associated with the frequency of initial assaults. The authors maintain that minor spousal violence is not related to other severe forms. The study by Feld and Strauss indicates that minor wife-perpetrated assaults predict continuous, severe, husband-perpetrated assaults. In other words, minor assaults by the wife increase the risk of husbands responding with more dangerous assaults, thereby increasing the need for treating couples in the wake of marital violence. Strauss' analysis of 2005 points out that female-perpetrated violence is a serious issue, even though it does not result in injury in most cases. This seriousness, the author argues, is based on the fact that minor wife-perpetrated violence increases the likelihood of one being a victim of severe husband-perpetrated violence in retaliation. Strauss maintains that ending wife beating is contingent upon ending the perceived harmless patterns of wife-perpetrated throwing of objects, kicking, and slapping. Particularly, the theories posit that the success of male-oriented batterer intervention programs is dependent on the change presented by their female partners. Fifth, batterer programs should separate high-risk repeat batterers from those who are once-only offenders instead of clustering all of them together. Strauss and Scott argue that approximately 25% of men re-assault their partners, and these men should be centrally placed in treatment and monitoring program. Gaundolf asserts that re-assaults occur quickly and are characterized with greater injuries to the victims. The author also observes that women's perception of safety, dropping out of treatment, and alcohol problems predict the chances of engaging in abuse. These predictors of re-offending validate the need for continuous improvement in batterer programs. Gaundolf attributes failures to the current batterer intervention programs to implementation problems, intention to treat design, and sample attrition, which limit the attainment of desired outcomes. While current cognitive behavioral intervention programs are effective for most participants, the recommended improvements include immediate response to violations, intensive programs for high-risk men, and consistently monitoring risks. Effective continuous improvement relies on repeated offender risk assessment, monitoring immediate risks, and examining short and long-term risks that minimize the treatment efficacy. For instance, the contribution of dropping out to reoffending mandates increased monitoring of those who failed to complete treatment programs. This monitoring and increased treatment are also fundamental for those who complete batterer programs but fail to show significant change. Sixth, there should be programs designed exclusively to address the needs of female perpetrators of domestic abuse. The needs as mentioned before refer to the factors, such as behaviors and attitudes that increase the risk of reoffending. Understanding women's needs is fundamental in developing evidence-based programs, thereby avoiding enrollment into programs exclusively developed for male perpetrators of abuse. Current batterer management programs that involve women use trauma-based counseling strategies, as well as features of male-oriented programs. Counseling approaches only resolve underlying histories of abuse. Feminist assumptions that informed the creation of male-oriented batterer intervention programs make no sense when applied to women who were perceived as victims and now perpetrate abuse. Some authors document needs presented by female perpetrators of abuse that do not exactly fit within the self-defense analogy presented by feminists. For instance, Dowd and colleagues, in examining treatment approaches for women who perpetrate violence, uncovered that the women were undereducated, socioeconomically disadvantaged, had mental health issues, had histories of abuse or victimization, and abused substances. Carney and Buttle, in examining changes among female perpetrators of abuse following a 16-week batterer intervention programs, revealed that court-ordered batterers presented significant changes in terms of the psychological variables, such as stress coping capabilities, control, lethality, violence, and truthfulness. Lawrence examines the Vista model that comprehends and contextualizes the use of violence by women. Self-defense motives warrant referring abusers to companion programs that offer continuous assessment in understanding other factors that contribute to the use of aggression. Drawing the relationship between shame and anger reduces the frequency of using violence among women. Seventh, the prevalence of mutuality in domestic violence validates the need for programs that offer a wider range of services, including couples therapy for joint recovery. Strauss and Scott argue that half of domestic violence is mutual, with the remaining half being split evenly between male-only and female-only violence. Female-perpetrated violence increases the risk of reoffending as documented by Feld and Strauss, who note that acts of minor violence by wives predict severe violence by husbands. Besides, Smith and colleagues argue that female perpetration of violence is the strongest predictor of one being a victim of abuse. Against this background, it is evident that treating both partners is essential in running effective batterer programs. The lack of, or minimal evidence supporting the efficacy of programs that treat a single partner as documented by Levesque validate the need for treating both partners. Cascardi and colleagues' study of 1992 found that up to 71% of clients seeking marital therapy reported being involved in at least one incident of intimate partner violence within the past year, with 86% being reciprocal, even though wives were more likely to report injuries. Heyman and Schley document the physical aggression couples treatment (PACT) model that holds every partner responsible for their own actions in the context of intimate partner violence, with the focus being increasing awareness on the dysfunctional aspects of their relationship. Osterman and Masson document restorative justice for dual arrests of domestic violence by arguing that gendered factors of crime and victimization impact restorative conference processes. These impacts are founded on the complexity of interacting needs, engagements, mental health, stereotypes, and the risks around shame. Restorative justice replaces retributive justice, which is aimed at subjecting offenders to harsh penalties, by focusing on rectifying the harm caused by violence. These harms include the psychological, emotional, physical, financial, and social effects of violence. Dangerousness assessments are essential in promoting the successful implementation of restorative justice. The differences in domestic violence situations validates the need for discarding interventions that misapply information gathered from extreme cases of violence. According to Osterman and Masson, restorative justice in the case of women should acknowledge the specific needs and circumstances and mainstream them into actual practice. Mills argues that criminal justice systems, by arresting, prosecuting, and incarcerating the perpetrators of abuse worsen the domestic violence problem. The author maintains that half of abused women choose to stay in abusive relationships because of emotional, religious, economic, and cultural reasons, thereby worsening the psychological stability of the victims through incarceration of the perpetrator. Mills asserts that women are as emotionally aggressive and physically violent as men are, with female aggression being a central component of intimate partner violence. Mills proposes restorative justice as the new approach to dealing with domestic violence that is based on abused women's experiences and compelling evidence. As opposed to shame or punishment, Mills' presentation of restorative justice encompasses the focus on healing and transformation that uses proven methods and the actual aspects of intimate partner violence. Van Darten and colleagues outline various considerations for treating women who perpetrate violence. First, female perpetrators of violence are not a homogeneous group because they present differentiated needs, and as such, robust programs are essential. The programs should address effective approaches to safety planning, the nature of violence, and a psychoeducational approach to exposing perpetrators to nonviolent alternatives to resolving relationship conflict. Second, a good number of female perpetrators of violence present histories of victimization, which exposes perpetrators to mental health issues and substance abuse. Thus, programs and policies addressing female perpetrators of violence should include trauma-related remedies. Third, female perpetrators of violence are at greater risk of being victims of domestic violence, especially considering the significance of relationships in female development and socialization. Women exposed to abusive and neglectful environments end up being violent, with the most appropriate solution as proposed by Van Duyten and colleagues being the cultivation of interpersonal skills. Fourth, violent women are more likely to be depressed and economically disadvantaged, which validates the need for the strength-based approach in the relevant programs. The approach focuses on the abuser's resources that could be mobilized for the attainment of desired clinical outcomes. Van Duyten and colleagues also list some gender-responsive programs for women, including domestic violence treatment for abusive women, Beyond Violence, VISTA, which was mentioned before, Beyond Anger and Violence, and Moving On. Levesque suggests that the trans-theoretical model is the most appropriate in treating individuals who perpetrate intimate partner violence. The model contains 4 stages of change, including the stage of change, decision balance, and self-efficacy.